Every morning for 3 months, Penn Thorne brought his young daughter to Morning Glory Diner in Oakwood Creek, and every morning he watched the same waitress serve them with perfect efficiency, but never once crack a smile. Her name was Bronte Croft, and while she was kind and attentive, there was a sadness in her eyes that seemed to weigh down every interaction. Penn couldn't stop wondering what had happened to make someone so young carry such heavy silence. Then, one quiet Tuesday, when his curiosity finally got the better of him, Penn gently asked Bronte why she never smiled. Her answer didn't just surprise him, it broke his heart completely, and what happened next would transform both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. If you're someone who believes that sometimes the most powerful healing happens when strangers choose to truly see each other, you're in exactly the right place. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Penn Thorne never considered himself particularly observant when it came to reading people. As a construction foreman who'd spent the last 15 years managing crews and deadlines, his world revolved around concrete details, blueprints, schedules, and making sure everyone got home safe at the end of the day. But there was something about the waitress at Morning Glory Diner that he couldn't shake. Something that made him pause in ways he wasn't used to. It had started 3 months ago, when he'd first walked through the glass doors of the small diner. On Maple Street in Oakwood Creek, he'd been desperately searching for a new routine. After his ex-wife relocated across the country for work, taking with her the predictable rhythm of shared custody that had anchored his life for the past 2 years. Suddenly, Penn found himself as a full-time single father to 7-year-old Sophie, and the mornings had become his biggest challenge. Sophie was particular about breakfast scrambled eggs, no cheese, wheat toast cut diagonally, and orange juice, with exactly 3 ice cubes. Their kitchen disasters had become legendary. Burnt eggs, smoke alarms, and tears before 8 a.m. had convinced Penn that maybe, just maybe, they needed professional help. That's how they'd stumbled into Morning Glory Diner, a cozy establishment with red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floors, and the kind of warm lighting that made everything feel like a Norman Rockwell painting. The diner was exactly what Oakwood Creek represented, a small town where people knew each other's names, where the coffee was always fresh, and where strangers became regulars after just a few visits. The owner, Mrs. Patterson, had run the place for over 20 years, and her staff treated customers like extended family. Almost all of them, anyway. From their very first visit, Penn had noticed her. Bronte Croft was her name, according to the small rectangular tag pinned to her uniform. She looked to be in her late 20s, with auburn hair usually pulled back in a neat ponytail and green eyes that seemed to hold entire conversations. She never spoke aloud. She was professional, efficient, and unfailingly kind to Sophie, always, remembering exactly how she liked her eggs and never forgetting the orange juice specification. But in all those weeks, through dozens of breakfast services, Penn had never once seen Bronte smile. It wasn't that she was rude or cold. On the contrary, she was one of the most attentive servers he'd ever encountered. She anticipated needs before they were voiced, refilled coffee cups without being asked, and always ensured Sophie had extra napkins for her inevitable spills. When Sophie had forgotten her favorite stuffed elephant one morning, Bronte had carefully wrapped it in a clean dish towel and kept it safe behind the counter until they returned. When Sophie struggled to reach the syrup dispenser, Bronte quietly adjusted it without making a big deal of the accommodation. Her kindness was genuine and consistent, but it was wrapped in a melancholy that Penn found increasingly difficult to ignore. While the other servers laughed with customers, shared weekend stories, and lit up when regular families walked through the door, Bronte moved through her shifts like someone carrying an invisible weight. She spoke when necessary, listened carefully to orders, and performed her job with a quiet competence that somehow made Her sadness even more noticeable. Penn had started paying attention to the small details. The way her shoulders seemed to carry tension even during slow morning shifts. How her smile, when it appeared for Sophie's benefit, never quite reached her eyes and faded the moment she thought no one was watching. The careful way she interacted with other staff members, polite and cooperative, but maintaining an emotional distance that suggested someone who had learned to protect herself by staying separate. Sophie, with the uncomplicated wisdom that 7-year-olds sometimes possessed, had asked about it first. "Daddy, why does the nice lady always look sad?" she'd whispered during one of their regular Tuesday breakfasts. Penn had offered a generic response about how some people were just quieter than others, but the question had stuck with him. Over the following weeks, Penn found himself studying Bronte more carefully. He watched how she handled difficult customers with unwavering patience, how she cleaned tables with methodical precision, and how she always took time to listen when elderly customers wanted to chat about their grandchildren or their aching joints. She was clearly someone who cared deeply about others, yet seemed to extend none of that compassion toward herself. The mystery of Bronte Croft had become an unexpected focal point in Penn's otherwise straightforward life. He'd catch himself arriving a few minutes early just to observe her pre-shift routine, or lingering over his coffee to watch how she interacted with different customers. It wasn't romantic interest, at least not initially. It was something deeper and more complex. It was the recognition of someone who seemed to be living in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of daily life while something essential remained locked away. Penn understood that feeling more than he cared to admit. Since becoming a full-time single father, since watching his marriage dissolve despite his best efforts, since rebuilding his entire life around Sophie's needs and schedules, he'd often felt like he was performing his own life rather than living it. But where his emotional numbness felt temporary, a protective mechanism while he figured out his new normal, Bronte seemed like something that had taken root and grown into a permanent part of who she was. That's why, on this particular Tuesday morning in November, when the autumn light was filtering through the diner's front windows and casting everything in gold, Penn had finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been building in his chest for weeks. He had no idea that her answer would change everything. Penn Thorne's life hadn't always been measured in breakfast routines and bedtime stories. Just 18 months earlier, he'd been a different man, entirely married for 8 years, living in a suburban house with a 2-car garage and a white picket fence that he'd installed himself. He'd been the kind of father who was present, but not primary, the one who handled weekend activities and evening homework help while his ex-wife managed the daily logistics of parenthood. The divorce hadn't been dramatic or explosive. In many ways, that made it harder to process. There had been no infidelity, no major betrayal, no moment of revelation that explained everything. Instead, there had been a slow, quiet erosion of connection that neither of them had noticed until it was too late to repair. They'd become roommates raising a daughter together, two people who cared about each other, but had somehow forgotten how to be married. When Jennifer announced she'd been offered a promotion that would require relocating to Seattle, Penn had supported her decision. He understood career ambitions, respected her drive, and wanted her to be happy. What he hadn't anticipated was how completely her departure would reshape every single aspect of his existence. Suddenly, he wasn't just a weekend dad or an every other holiday father. He was the primary caregiver, the decision-maker, the one responsible for everything from Sophie's daily nutrition to her emotional well-being. The learning curve had been steep and unforgiving. Penn discovered that there was an entire universe of parental knowledge he'd somehow missed during Sophie's first 7 years. He'd never paid attention to which breakfast cereal she preferred, which cartoon characters were currently acceptable, or the intricate social dynamics of second-grade friendships. He'd been present, but not fully engaged, and now he was paying the price for his previous emotional absence. The mornings were particularly brutal. Sophie was not naturally an early riser, and Penn's construction schedule required him to be on job sites by 7 a.m. This meant a 6 a.m. wake-up call for a 7-year-old who preferred to ease into consciousness gradually, followed by 30 minutes of negotiations about clothing choices, breakfast options, and which stuffed animal would accompany her to school. Penn's previous morning routine had involved coffee, a quick shower, and 20 minutes of checking emails. Now it involved elaborate hairstyling sessions, lost shoes, forgotten homework, and at least 3 minor meltdowns before 8 a.m. The kitchen had become his nemesis. Penn could frame a house, install plumbing, and wire electrical systems, but scrambled eggs consistently defeated him. He either burned them into rubbery yellow discs or undercooked them into a watery mess. That made Sophie gag. Toast seemed straightforward until he discovered that Sophie required her bread to be toasted to a very specific shade of golden brown, too light, and it was raw, too dark, and it was burnt, and the acceptable range appeared to be approximately 30 seconds wide. Penn's confidence as a parent had taken a significant hit during those first few months. At work, he was respected and competent, someone who could solve complex problems and manage diverse teams. At home, he felt like he was failing at the most basic requirements of single parenthood. Sophie was patient with his learning process, but he could see the adjustment in her eyes, the realization that her daily life was going to be different now, less predictable, less smooth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part. During his marriage, Penn had been part of a parenting team. When he didn't know how to handle a situation, Jennifer was there with answers. When Sophie had a fever or a nightmare, or a playground conflict, there was someone else who shared the responsibility and the worry. Now every decision was his alone, every mistake was his to own, and every success felt hollow because there was no one to share it with. Penn's social life had evaporated almost immediately. His married friends were kind but busy with their own families, and his single friends couldn't relate to the constraints of full-time fatherhood. Weekend plans now revolved around Sophie's schedule rather than his preferences. Date nights were theoretical rather than practical. Even his relationship with his own parents had become complicated, as they offered well-meaning but outdated advice about child rearing that didn't account for the realities of modern single parenthood. Work had become his refuge, but even that presented challenges. Construction sites weren't family-friendly environments, and Penn couldn't take Sophie with him when he needed to work overtime or handle emergency calls. He'd had to hire a babysitter for after-school care, arrange backup childcare for sick days, and turn down projects that required extensive travel. His career ambitions had shifted from advancement to stability, from growth to maintenance. The loneliness was constant and multifaceted. There was the practical loneliness of having no one to share daily parenting decisions with, but there was also an emotional loneliness that cut deeper. Penn missed adult conversation that wasn't related to school schedules or dietary preferences. He missed having someone who understood his work stress, his financial concerns, his fears about whether he was doing enough for Sophie. He missed being seen as a complete person rather than just Sophie's dad. That's why the routine at Morning Glory Diner had become so important to him. For 30 minutes each morning, Penn could sit in a booth with Sophie and pretend they were a normal family having a normal breakfast. The diner represented consistency in a life that had become unpredictably chaotic. Mrs. Patterson knew their names. The other servers remembered Sophie's preferences, and for a brief time each day, Penn felt like he belonged somewhere. But it was Bronte who had captured his attention in a way that surprised him. Not because he was looking for romance, his emotional bandwidth was completely consumed by single parenthood, but because he recognized something familiar in her carefully controlled sadness. She moved through her work with the same determined competence that Penn applied to his own daily survival. She was kind without being effusive, professional without being cold, present without being fully engaged. Watching Bronte had become Penn's daily reminder that he wasn't the only person carrying invisible burdens. That emotional struggle didn't always announce itself loudly. Her quiet sadness made him feel less alone in his own quiet struggle to rebuild his life around new responsibilities and old grief. He had no idea that the question he was about to ask would reveal just how much they actually had in common. It was the crying that changed everything. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in November. Penn and Sophie had arrived at Morning Glory Diner at their usual time, sliding into their regular booth by the window where Sophie could watch the school buses lumber down Maple Street while she ate. The autumn light filtered through the glass, casting everything in that particular golden hue that made even the most ordinary moments feel touched by magic. Bronte had appeared at their table with her characteristic quiet efficiency, setting down Sophie's orange juice with exactly 3 ice cubes and Penn's black coffee without being asked. She'd taken their order with the same polite attention she always showed: scrambled eggs, no cheese, wheat toast cut diagonally for Sophie, and the Tuesday special for Penn. Her voice had been steady, professional, giving no indication that this morning would be any different from the dozens that had come before. But about 10 minutes later, as Penn was helping Sophie color the placemat maze while they waited for their food, he heard something that made him look up sharply. It was a sound so unexpected in the context of Morning Glory Diner that it took him a moment to process what he was hearing. Somewhere in the kitchen, someone was crying, not the dramatic sobbing of a soap opera, but the quiet, broken sound of someone trying desperately not to be heard. It was the kind of crying that spoke of exhaustion rather than immediate grief, the sound of someone who had been holding something in for far too long and had finally reached their breaking point. Penn glanced around the diner, trying to locate the source. The other customers seemed oblivious, continuing their conversations about weather and weekend plans. Mrs. Patterson was at the register, cheerfully ringing up an elderly couple's breakfast bill. The other servers moved through their sections with normal efficiency, showing no signs of distress. That's when Penn realized the crying was coming from the kitchen, and more specifically, from the direction where Bronte had disappeared after taking their order. Sophie looked up from her coloring, her crayon paused mid-stroke. "Daddy, is someone sad?" she whispered, her 7-year-old intuition picking up on the emotional undercurrent that most adults had missed. Penn nodded slowly, his attention focused entirely on the sounds coming from the kitchen. The crying continued for several more minutes, not loud enough to disturb the general atmosphere of the diner, but persistent enough to suggest that whoever was upset was struggling to regain their composure. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the crying stopped. 5 minutes later, Bronte emerged from the kitchen carrying their plates, her face composed and professional. But Penn was watching now with the focused attention he usually reserved for structural problems on construction sites, and he could see what others might miss. Her eyes were slightly red, though she'd clearly made an effort to rinse her face. Her hands, normally steady as a surgeon's, had the faintest tremor as she set down Sophie's plate. Most telling of all, the careful emotional distance she usually maintained seemed to have developed hairline cracks, like a wall that had been stressed beyond its limits. "Here we go," she said, her voice only slightly hoarser than usual. "Scrambled eggs, no cheese, toast cut diagonally, and the Tuesday special, with extra hash browns." Sophie looked up at Bronte with the unguarded curiosity that 7-year-olds possessed. "Are you okay?" she asked simply, her question carrying none of the careful social boundaries that adults typically maintained. For just a moment, Bronte's professional composure wavered completely. Penn saw her throat work as she swallowed hard, saw her blink rapidly as if fighting back fresh tears. Her hand, still holding the empty serving tray, tightened until her knuckles went white. "I'm fine, sweetie," she managed, but her voice cracked slightly on the words. "Just having a long morning." But Sophie, with the persistence that made her both endearing and exhausting, wasn't satisfied with the dismissal. "My daddy says it's okay to be sad sometimes," she continued earnestly. "He says feelings are like weather, they come and go, but they're all natural." Penn felt his chest tighten at hearing his own words reflected back through Sophie's innocent concern. He'd developed that particular piece of parenting wisdom during the difficult months after the divorce, when Sophie had struggled to understand why her family structure was changing. Now hearing it applied to Bronte's obvious distress, the words seemed to carry new weight. Bronte looked down at Sophie, and for the first time since Penn had been coming to the diner, something genuine flickered across her face. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of surprised recognition, as if someone had unexpectedly offered her a lifeline. "That's very wise," she said softly, and Penn could hear that she meant it. "Your daddy sounds like a smart man." "He tries really hard," Sophie said matter-of-factly, then returned to her eggs as if she hadn't just delivered an emotional truth bomb to a virtual stranger, but the moment had created something. A crack in the careful boundaries that had previously defined Bronte's interactions with their family. Penn could see it in the way she lingered at their table, just a few seconds longer than necessary, in the way her gaze met his with something that looked almost like vulnerability. "Is there anything else I can get you?" she asked, but the question seemed to carry subtext now, as if she was asking something deeper than whether they needed more coffee or extra syrup. Penn found himself at a crossroads. For 3 months, he'd respected the invisible walls Bronte had constructed around herself. He'd appreciated her service, noted her kindness to Sophie, and worried about her obvious sadness, but he'd never crossed the line into personal territory. Part of him knew that the smart thing, the socially appropriate thing, was to say they were fine and let her move on to her other tables. But Sophie's innocent question had opened a door, and Penn could see that Bronte was standing on the threshold, uncertain whether to step through or pull back into her familiar isolation. "Actually," Penn said carefully, "I was wondering if I could ask you something." Bronte's entire body tensed, and Penn could see her preparing to retreat behind professional boundaries. But something in his tone, or perhaps the vulnerability that the morning's events had already exposed, made her pause. "Of course," she said, though her voice carried a note of caution. Penn glanced at Sophie, who was completely absorbed in creating elaborate patterns with her remaining scrambled eggs, then looked back at Bronte. The question that had been building in his chest for weeks was suddenly right there, waiting to be spoken. "In all the times we've been coming here," he said gently, "I've never once seen you smile." "Not really, and I was wondering ... He paused, searching for the right words, the ones that would invite rather than intrude. "I was wondering if you're okay. If there's something that's making you carry all this sadness alone." The words hung in the air between them, as fragile and significant as the first note of a song that might change everything. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Bronte simply stared at Penn. Her serving tray trembled slightly in her hands, and he could see her internal struggle playing out across her features, the desire to flee warring with something deeper, a longing that she'd buried so carefully that even she seemed surprised by its sudden emergence. She began then. Stopped, her voice catching. She glanced around the diner, clearly aware that they were having this conversation in the middle of her workplace, surrounded by other customers and co-workers. "I should really get back to Bronte." Penn's voice was gentle but firm. "It's okay. You don't have to answer right now. But I need you to know that someone noticed, that someone cares." Something in his tone, or perhaps the simple fact that he'd used her name with such quiet kindness, seemed to crack something open in her carefully constructed armor. Her shoulders sagged slightly, as if she'd been holding them rigid for so long that relaxing them felt like a physical relief. "Why?" she whispered, and the word carried the weight of someone who had stopped believing that anyone would care enough to ask. Penn considered his answer carefully. "Because," he said slowly, "I recognize what it looks like when someone is trying to survive rather than live. And because Sophie likes you, and because—" He paused, searching for honesty rather than politeness. "Because I know what it's like. To feel invisible, even when you're surrounded by people every day." Bronte's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. She looked down at Sophie, who had abandoned her egg patterns and was now drawing elaborate flowers on her napkin with a worn crayon. "She's lucky to have you," Bronte said quietly, and Penn could hear the genuine emotion in her voice. "We both are," Sophie chimed in without looking up from her artwork, her matter-of-fact tone carrying the unconscious wisdom that sometimes emerges from the mouths of 7-year-olds. "My daddy says families aren't just the people you live with. Sometimes they're the people who take care of you when you need it most." Penn felt his throat tighten. He'd said those words to Sophie during one of her particularly difficult nights after the divorce, when she'd been crying about missing her mother and feeling like their little family wasn't complete anymore. Now hearing them reflected back in this context, they seemed to carry new significance. Bronte's composure finally cracked completely. A single tear rolled down her cheek before she could stop it, and she quickly brushed it away with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is completely unprofessional. I shouldn't be. You shouldn't." "Be human?" Penn interrupted gently. "You shouldn't be allowed to have feelings during work hours? Bronte, you've been taking care of everyone who walks through that door for months. Who takes care of you?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither of them was sure they should cross. But something had shifted in the last few minutes. Some invisible barrier had been lowered, and Penn could see that Bronte was struggling with whether to trust this unexpected offering of compassion. "I get off at 3, she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. If you really want to know why I don't smile, I could ... We could talk then, if you want." Penn felt something loosening in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "I'd like that," he said simply. "Sophie has art class at the community center on Tuesdays. We could meet after I drop her off. There's a bench in Willow Park," Bronte said, naming the small green space behind the library, where families often brought their youngsters to feed ducks and play on the modest playground equipment. "By the pond. It's usually quiet in the afternoons." Penn nodded. 3:30? 3:30, she confirmed, and seemed to realize she was still holding her serving tray in the middle of a conversation that had veered far from anything resembling normal customer service. "I should really go," Penn said with a smile, the first genuine smile he'd worn in months. "We'll be fine. And Bronte, thank you." She looked puzzled. "For what?" "For trusting us enough to let us see you," he said simply. After she walked away to attend to her other tables, Sophie looked up from her napkin art with the serious expression she wore when processing complex information. "Daddy," she said thoughtfully, "I think the sad lady needs friends." Penn reached over and smoothed down one of Sophie's stubborn cowlicks, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing. "I think you're right, sweetheart. I think she needs friends very much. Are we going to be her friends?" Penn considered the question, thinking about the vulnerability he'd just witnessed, the careful way Bronte had extended this tentative invitation for connection, the obvious loneliness that seemed to surround her like a second skin. "I think we're going to try," he said finally. "If she let us." The rest of their breakfast passed quietly, but there was a different quality to the silence now. It wasn't the comfortable routine they'd established over months of regular visits, but something charged with possibility and anticipation. Penn found himself watching Bronte move through her section of the diner with new eyes, noticing things he'd missed before. She was efficient, but there was no joy in her movements. She was kind to customers, but maintained careful emotional distance. She worked with the other servers, but didn't participate in their casual conversations or shared laughter. It was as if she existed parallel to the warm community of Morning Glory Diner without ever quite being part of it. When they were ready to leave, Bronte appeared at their table to clear their plates. The earlier vulnerability was still there, but she'd regained most of her professional composure. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, as she always did, but this time, Penn heard the question differently. This time, it sounded less like routine customer service and more like someone who had begun to count on their presence, who had started to look forward to the one part of her day that felt like connection rather than performance. "Absolutely," Penn said, and he meant it with a fervor that surprised him. As they gathered their coats and Sophie's scattered crayons, Penn realized that something fundamental had shifted in their morning routine. They were no longer just customers and server, no longer just polite strangers sharing breakfast space. They had become people who cared about each other's well-being, people who had agreed to show up for each other in whatever small ways they could manage. Walking to the car, Penn felt lighter than he had in months. Not because his own problems had disappeared, but because he'd been reminded that healing sometimes happened not through solving your own pain, but through reaching out to help someone else carry theirs. In a few hours, he would learn exactly how heavy Bronte's burden had been, and why she had spent so many months afraid to smile. At 3:25 p.m., Penn sat alone on the wooden bench beside Willow Park's small pond, watching a family of ducks glide across the water's surface with the kind of graceful ease that made their movement look effortless. Sophie was safely settled in her art class, enthusiastically painting what she described as a rainbow castle with purple flowers, and Penn had arrived early to collect his thoughts and calm the unexpected nervousness that had been building in his chest since morning. He wasn't sure what he expected from this conversation. In his construction work, Penn was used to problems that had clear solutions. If a foundation was cracked, you repaired it. If a beam was structurally unsound, you replaced it. Human emotions were Messier territory, full of variables he couldn't measure and solutions that didn't fit neatly into blueprints. But something about Bronte's carefully hidden pain had called to something in him that he'd thought was buried beneath the practical demands of single parenthood. Maybe it was recognition, the way one person carrying invisible weight could sense another doing the same. Maybe it was simply the basic human instinct to help when someone was drowning, even if you weren't entirely sure you knew how to swim yourself. At exactly 30, Penn saw Bronte approaching along the gravel path that wound through the park. She'd changed out of her uniform into jeans and a soft gray sweater, and without the professional armor of her work clothes, she looked younger and somehow more fragile. Her auburn hair was down now, catching the late afternoon light as she walked, and Penn could see her hands nervously adjusting the strap of her purse as she drew closer. "Hi," she said quietly when she reached the bench, her voice carrying the same cautious tone she'd used that morning when agreeing to this meeting. "Hi," Penn replied, gesturing to the space beside him. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." Bronte settled onto the bench, leaving careful space between them, close enough for conversation, far enough to maintain the kind of protective distance that suggested someone who had learned to be wary of intimacy. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "I'm not very good at this, talking about myself." Penn nodded, understanding that feeling more than she probably realized. "Neither am I, honestly. But sometimes I think we carry things alone for so long that we forget other people might be willing to help us carry them." For a few minutes they sat in comfortable silence, watching the ducks and listening to the distant sounds of playground laughter from families, enjoying the unseasonably warm November afternoon. Penn didn't push for conversation, sensing that Bronte needed time to find her words, to decide how much trust she was willing to extend to this relative stranger who had somehow seen through her carefully constructed facade. "You asked why I don't smile," she said finally, her voice so quiet that Penn had to lean slightly closer to hear her. "The truth is, I used to smile all the time. Too much, according to some people. I was one of those annoyingly cheerful people who found joy in small things, perfect coffee, good books, strangers holding doors for each other. Penn watched her profile as she spoke, noting the way her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the careful control in her voice that suggested someone telling a story she'd never shared aloud before. 2 years ago, I was engaged to the most wonderful man, Bronte continued, and Penn felt something twist in his chest at the past tense of her words. His name was David. He was a paramedic, which meant he spent his days literally saving people's lives, and somehow he still had energy left over to save mine too. He had this way of making everything feel possible, like no problem was too big to solve if you approached it with enough love and creativity. She paused, taking a shaky breath, and Penn resisted the urge to reach out and take her hand. Instead, he waited, offering his presence and attention as the only comfort he knew how to give. "We were supposed to get married in June," Bronte said, her voice beginning to crack. "I had the dress. We'd booked the church. My sister was flying in from Portland to be my maid of honor. David was so excited about our honeymoon. He'd planned this elaborate road trip through national parks because he knew I loved hiking and taking pictures of wildflowers." Penn felt his throat tighten, knowing with increasing certainty that this story wasn't going to have a happy ending. On April 15th, 2 months before our wedding, David was responding to a call about a multi-car accident on Highway 52. Bronte continued, and now the tears she'd been fighting all morning began to fall freely. It was raining. The roads were slick. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit the ambulance. Penn's stomach dropped. He'd heard variations of this story before, the randomness of tragedy, the way life could change completely in the space of a heartbeat, but hearing it from Bronte, watching her relive the moment that had shattered her world, made it feel immediate and devastating in a way that statistics never could. "David was killed instantly," she whispered, the words barely audible. "The drunk driver walked away without a scratch. 3 other people died that day because David couldn't get to them. People who might have lived if someone else had been driving, if the timing had been different by 30 seconds, if it hadn't been raining, if 100 different small things had aligned differently." Penn felt tears pricking his own eyes as the weight of her loss settled over him. He'd expected sadness, maybe relationship troubles or family problems, but this level of devastation, the loss of a life partner, a future, an entire identity, built around shared dreams, was beyond anything he'd imagined. "I'm so sorry," he said, and the words felt inadequate, too small to hold the magnitude of her grief. "Bronte, I'm so incredibly sorry." She turned to look at him then, and Penn saw that her tears weren't just about the loss itself, but about something deeper, kind of survivor's guilt that had been eating at her for 2 years. "The worst part," she said, her voice breaking completely, "is that I was supposed to be with him that day. I'd taken a shift at the diner to earn extra money for our honeymoon, but originally I was going to ride along with David. He loved having me there when he could arrange it, said I had a good eye for spotting details that might help with patient care." Penn's heart clenched as he began to understand the full scope of her burden. "If I had been there," Bronte continued, "maybe I would have seen the drunk driver coming. Maybe I could have warned David. Maybe he would have taken a different route, or stopped for coffee, or any of 1,000 things that might have changed what happened. Instead, I was serving pancakes and making small talk while the man I loved was dying alone." The dam finally burst, and Bronte began to sob with the kind of raw, broken sound that comes from grief that has been carried in silence for too long. Without thinking, Penn reached out and gently placed his hand over both of hers, offering the only comfort he could, his presence and the promise that she didn't have to carry this alone anymore. "That's why I don't smile," she managed between sobs. "Because every time I feel even a moment of happiness, it feels like a betrayal. Like I'm forgetting him, or moving on too easily, or proving that what we had wasn't as important as I thought it was." Penn felt his own tears falling now, not just for Bronte's loss, but for the recognition of his own familiar struggle with guilt and survival, and the weight of continuing to live when someone you love is gone. Different circumstances, different kind of loss, but the same fundamental question: how do you keep living when part of you died with them? For several minutes, Penn simply held Bronte's hands while she cried, not trying to fix anything or offer empty platitudes, but just being present in her pain. He understood, perhaps better than she realized, what it felt like to carry crushing guilt about outcomes you couldn't control, to replay endless scenarios where different choices might have led to different endings. When her sobs finally quieted into shaky breaths, Penn spoke quietly, his voice thick with his own unshed tears. "Can I tell you something?" he asked gently. "Something I've never told anyone else?" Bronte looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen but alert, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "The night before Jennifer told me she was moving to Seattle," Penn began, his words coming slowly and carefully, "Sophie had a nightmare. She came into our bedroom crying, wanting to crawl into bed with us like she used to when she was smaller. Jennifer was exhausted from work stress, and I was tired too, and instead of welcoming Sophie, I told her she was too old for that kind of thing. I carried her back to her room and made her stay there." Penn's voice caught, and he had to pause to steady himself. The next morning, Jennifer announced her decision to take the job and move across the country. And all I could think about was how I'd sent Sophie away that last night when we were all still a family. How I'd chosen my own comfort over my daughter's need for security. How if I'd been a better father, a better husband, maybe Jennifer wouldn't have felt like she needed to escape to the other side of the country. Bronte was staring at him now, her own grief momentarily forgotten as she recognized the familiar weight of self-blame in his words. For months afterward, Penn continued, every single morning when Sophie would climb into bed with me for cuddles, I'd think about that missed opportunity. Every time she had a bad day at school, every time she cried about missing her mom, every time she seemed sad or anxious, I convinced myself it was because I'd failed her when she needed me most. I told myself that if I'd just been warmer that night, more welcoming, maybe everything would have been different. He turned to meet Bronte's gaze directly. The guilt was eating me alive. I was going through the motions of being a father, but inside I felt like a fraud. Like I didn't deserve Sophie's love or trust, because I'd somehow caused our family to fall apart. "Penn," Bronte whispered, and he could hear the recognition in her voice, the understanding of someone who had walked that same dark path of self-recrimination. "It wasn't until I started coming to the diner and watching you," Penn said, "that I began to understand something important. I was so focused on seeing your pain, your guilt, your struggle to forgive yourself, that I started to see my own situation more clearly. Because when I looked at you, I could see so clearly that David's death wasn't your fault. That taking a work shift to earn money for your honeymoon wasn't selfish or wrong. That being a loving, caring partner doesn't mean you have supernatural powers to prevent tragedy." Bronte's breath hitched, and fresh tears began to fall. But these seemed different somehow, not just tears of grief, but tears of recognition and relief. "And if I could see that about your situation so clearly," Penn continued, "maybe I was wrong about mine too. Maybe Jennifer didn't leave because I was a bad husband. Maybe my marriage didn't end because I told Sophie to sleep in her own bed one night. Maybe sometimes people make decisions based on their own needs and dreams, and it doesn't mean the people they leave behind were inadequate or unworthy." Penn felt something shifting in his own chest as he spoke these words aloud for the first time, as if naming his guilt was somehow reducing its power over him. "You helped me understand that," he said softly. "Not by doing anything specific, but by letting me care about someone else's pain. By giving me a reason to practice compassion that I couldn't seem to extend to myself." Bronte turned her hand palm up beneath his, threading their fingers together in a gesture that felt both intimate and entirely natural. You're saying that trying to help me somehow helped you too. Penn nodded. These past few months watching. You carry that grief and guilt so gracefully. Seeing how hard you work to take care of everyone around you, even when you're barely holding yourself together. It made me realize that I've been expecting perfection from myself in a way I'd never expect from anyone else. That I've been punishing myself for being human. And you think I've been doing the same thing, Bronte said, not a question, but a recognition. I think, Penn said carefully, that David loved you enough to plan an elaborate honeymoon around your interests. That he was excited about building a life with you. That he asked you to ride along with him sometimes because he valued your presence and insights. Does that sound like the kind of man who would want you to spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for not being in the right place at the right time to prevent the unpreventable? Bronte's tears came faster now, but Penn could see something else in her expression, a kind of desperate hope, as if she was hearing something she'd been waiting 2 years to believe. I miss him so much, she whispered. I miss having someone who is excited about the future with me. I miss having plans and dreams and reasons to laugh. But every time I start to feel even a little bit happy, I feel like I'm betraying his memory. What if, Penn suggested gently, instead of seeing happiness as betrayal, you saw it as honoring what he gave you? What if the best way to remember David isn't to stop living, but to live fully enough for both of you? The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, and Penn could see Bronte considering them, weighing them against 2 years of carefully constructed guilt and self-punishment. I don't know how to do that, she admitted. I don't remember how to be happy without feeling guilty about it. Maybe, Penn said, we could figure it out together. Maybe we could help each other remember that surviving doesn't mean we didn't love deeply enough, and moving forward doesn't mean we're forgetting what we lost. For the first time since he'd known her, Bronte smiled, not the careful professional expression she wore at work, but a real smile, small and tentative but genuine. It transformed her entire face, and Penn felt his heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with grief or guilt and everything to do with recognition, connection, and the possibility of something beautiful growing from the soil of shared understanding. I'd like that, she said quietly. I'd really like that. As the late afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting golden light across the pond and the park around them, Penn realized that something fundamental had shifted for both of them. They were no longer just two people carrying separate burdens of loss and guilt. They had become two people who had chosen to trust each other with their deepest pain, and in doing so, had discovered that healing could be a shared journey rather than a solitary struggle. For the first time in months, Penn felt like he was living his life rather than just performing it. And beside him, Bronte was smiling. The next morning, Penn and Sophie arrived at Morning Glory Diner with an energy that felt different from their usual routine. There was anticipation in Penn's step, a lightness he hadn't carried in months, and Sophie bounced beside him, chattering about her art class project and asking if Miss Bronte would want to see the picture she'd drawn of them all sitting together at their special table. She's not just our waitress anymore, is she, Daddy? Sophie asked as they approached the familiar glass doors. She's our friend now. Penn smiled, remembering the way Bronte had looked when they'd parted the evening before, not completely healed, not magically cured of her grief, but somehow lighter, as if sharing her burden had made it bearable rather than crushing. I think she is, sweetheart. I really think she is. They pushed through the door, the familiar bell chiming their arrival, and Penn automatically scanned the dining room for Bronte's auburn ponytail and efficient movements. The diner was busier than usual for a Wednesday morning, filled with the regular crowd of commuters grabbing coffee and early retirees, lingering over newspapers and conversation. But Bronte was nowhere to be seen. Penn felt a small flutter of uncertainty. Maybe she was in the kitchen, or taking a quick break, or helping with something in the back office. They made their way to their usual booth, and Penn helped Sophie out of her jacket while keeping one eye on the service area, waiting for Bronte to appear with her quiet smile and their regular order already memorized. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. A different server approached their table, a cheerful middle-aged woman named Diane who'd worked at the diner almost as long as Mrs. Patterson had owned it. She carried herself with the confident efficiency of someone who knew every customer's preferences and could handle any breakfast-related emergency with practiced ease. "Good morning, you two," Diane said warmly, pulling out her order pad. "What can I get you started with today?" Penn hesitated, glancing around the dining room one more time. "Is Bronte working this morning, Bronte?" Diane's expression shifted slightly, a shadow of concern crossing her features. "Oh, honey, she called in sick today. Sounded pretty rough too, poor thing. But don't you worry, I'll take good care of you." "Now what'll it be?" Penn ordered their usual breakfast, but the food seemed to lose its appeal before it even arrived. Sophie kept looking toward the kitchen, clearly disappointed by the absence of their newfound friend. "Is Miss Bronte really sick, Daddy? Or is she just sad again?" The question lodged in Penn's chest like a splinter. Yesterday afternoon, Bronte had seemed hopeful, maybe even cautiously optimistic about the possibility of healing. But Penn also understood that recovery from deep grief wasn't linear, that breakthrough moments could be followed by setbacks, that hope and despair could exist side by side in ways that made no logical sense. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said. "Honestly, but people need time to feel better, and sometimes that means taking days to rest." Thursday morning brought the same disappointment. Diane appeared at their table with an apologetic smile and the news that Bronte was still under the weather. "Flu's been going around," she said with the practiced sympathy of someone who'd seen employees call in sick countless times over the years. "Hopefully she'd be back soon." But Penn caught something in Diane's eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that suggested this wasn't just about the flu. Something about the way she avoided direct eye contact, the slight hesitation before she spoke, made him suspect there was more to Bronte's absence than a simple illness stopped by Friday. Penn's concern had evolved into something approaching panic. 3 days without any sign of Bronte, 3 mornings of Sophie asking where their friend was and why she hadn't come back to work yet. Penn found himself paying closer attention to the conversations around them, listening for any mention of Bronte from the other servers or Mrs. Patterson herself. "Daddy," Sophie said as they finished their Friday breakfast, "what if Miss Bronte is more than sick? What if she's sad sick, like when you have sad feelings that make your body hurt too?" Penn stared at his daughter, struck by her intuitive understanding of something he'd been trying not to acknowledge. What if Bronte's absence wasn't about physical illness at all? What if their conversation on Tuesday had triggered something? Relapse into grief, a resurgence of guilt, a fear that opening up to them had somehow betrayed David's memory. The thought made Penn's stomach clench with a mixture of worry and self-recrimination. Had he pushed too hard? Had he encouraged her to share things she wasn't ready to discuss? Had his attempt to help somehow made things worse? After dropping Sophie at school, Penn made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just a week earlier. Instead of heading directly to his construction site, he drove back to the diner and asked to speak with Mrs. Patterson. The owner was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd been running the diner since before Penn was born. She had kind eyes but a direct manner that suggested she'd seen every possible variety of human drama play out in her establishment and had little patience for anything that wasn't straightforward. "I'm worried about Bronte," Penn said without preamble. "My daughter and I have been coming here for months, and we've gotten to know her a little. Her being out sick for 3 days, it doesn't feel right." Mrs. Patterson studied him for a long moment, as if trying to gauge his motives. "Bronte's a good worker," she said carefully. "Been with me almost 2 years. Never missed more than a day here and there, and always gave plenty of notice when she needed time off. But this time is different," Penn pressed. "She called in sick." But you're worried it's something else. The older woman sighed, suddenly looking tired. Tuesday night, after her shift, Bronte came to me and said she might need a few days to sort some things out. Said she was dealing with some personal matters that had gotten stirred up, and she needed to figure out how to handle them. She promised she wasn't quitting, just needed some space to think. Penn felt his heart sink. He'd been right there. Conversation had triggered something, and instead of helping, he'd somehow made things worse. "Did she say anything else?" he asked. "Anything about what kind of personal matters?" Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "Bronte's always been private. I've never pushed her to share more than she wanted to. But I will say this, she looked different. Tuesday night. Not worse, exactly, but unsettled, like someone who'd been carrying something heavy, and suddenly wasn't sure if they wanted to put it down or hold on tighter." Penn left the diner with more questions than answers and a growing certainty that he needed to find Bronte. Not to fix anything or push her to return to work, but to make sure she knew she wasn't alone. That whatever she was struggling with didn't have to be carried in isolation. The problem was, he realized with a sick feeling, he had no idea how to reach her. He didn't have her phone number, didn't know where she lived, didn't even know her last name beyond the Croft on her name tag. Their entire relationship had existed within the confines of Morning Glory Diner, and now that she'd stepped outside those boundaries, he had no way to follow. That evening, as he tucked Sophie into bed, his daughter looked up at him with worried eyes. "Daddy, are we going to lose Miss Bronte like we lost Monty?" "Not the same way, but like when people go away and don't come back." Penn felt something break open in his chest, not the painful crack of loss, but the desperate urgency of someone who suddenly understood exactly what was at stake. In just a few short days, Bronte had become more than a friendly waitress or even a friend. She had become part of their small family's foundation, a source of hope and healing that Penn hadn't realized he'd been desperately needing. And now she was gone, and he had no idea if she was coming back. Penn Thorne had built a career on problem solving. When faced with structural challenges on construction sites, he approached them methodically, assessed the situation, identify the resources available, create a plan, and execute it step by step until the problem was resolved. But sitting in his truck outside Morning Glory Diner on Saturday morning, he realized that finding a missing person in a small town required a completely different set of skills, ones he wasn't entirely sure he possessed. Sophie sat beside him, in the passenger seat, her seatbelt carefully adjusted and her expression serious in the way that suggested she understood the gravity of their mission. They'd driven to the diner early, before the breakfast rush, hoping to catch Mrs. Patterson during a quieter moment when she might be more willing to share information. "What if she doesn't want to tell us where Miss Bronte lives?" Sophie asked, voicing the same concern that had been keeping Penn awake since Thursday night. "Then we'll have to think of another way to find her," Penn replied, though he wasn't entirely sure what that other way might look like. "The important thing is that we don't give up. Sometimes when people are hurting, they need to know that someone cares enough to look for them." Inside the diner, Mrs. Patterson was restocking coffee filters behind the counter, her movements efficient despite the early hour. She looked up when Penn and Sophie approached, and something in her expression suggested she'd been expecting this conversation. "I thought you might be back," she said without preamble. "You've got that look people get when they're worried about someone and can't let it go." Penn felt Sophie's small hand slip into his, offering silent support. "I know this might be crossing a line," he began carefully, "but I'm really concerned about Bronte. My daughter and we care about her. And I can't shake the feeling that she's isolating herself when she needs support the most." Mrs. Patterson studied him for a long moment, her weathered hands still folding coffee filters with automatic precision. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "I don't know," Penn admitted. "Maybe just tell me if there's anything I can do to help, or if you think she'd want to hear from us. I don't want to intrude, but I also don't want her to think we've forgotten." About her or that we don't care? The older woman set down the coffee filters and leaned against the counter, her expression thoughtful. You know, in 23 years of running this place, I've learned to read people pretty well. And I can tell you that whatever happened between you and Bronte on Tuesday, it wasn't bad. Difficult, maybe, emotional, certainly, but not bad. Penn felt a small surge of relief, though it was tempered by continued worry. She mentioned you, actually, Mrs. Patterson continued, and Penn's heart leaped. Said you and your little one had shown her kindness when she needed it most. Said she was grateful for the conversation, but that it had stirred up some things she needed to work through. Did she say what kind of things? Sophie asked, her 7-year-old directness cutting through the careful adult diplomacy. Mrs. Patterson smiled at Sophie, her expression softening. She said she was trying to figure out how to honor her past while still being open to her future. Said it was harder than she expected, like learning to walk again after being still for a very long time. Penn felt his throat tighten. That sounded exactly like something Bronte would say, and it gave him hope that their conversation hadn't sent her spiraling deeper into grief, but rather had challenged her to consider possibilities she'd been afraid to contemplate. Mrs. Patterson, Penn said quietly, I know you probably can't give me her address or phone number, and I respect that. But is there any way you could let her know that we're thinking about her, that we're here if she needs anything? The diner owner was quiet for a long moment, studying Penn's face as if trying to read his intentions. Finally, she reached under the counter and pulled out a small notepad. I can't give you her information, she said carefully, but I might be able to deliver a message. If you wanted to write something down. Penn accepted the notepad with hands that were steadier than he felt. What did you write to someone who was struggling with grief and guilt and the terrifying possibility of healing? How did you offer support without overstepping? How did you express care without creating pressure? He glanced down at Sophie, who was watching him with complete confidence in his ability to find the right words. Taking a deep breath, he began. To write, Bronte, Sophie and I wanted you to know that we're thinking about you. We understand that sometimes healing means taking a step back to figure things out, and we want you to know that we respect whatever space you need, but we also want you to know that you're not alone. Whatever you're working through, whatever you're feeling, you don't have to carry it by yourself anymore. We meant what we said about helping each other figure out how to live with loss and still find reasons to smile. Take all the time you need. We'll be here when you're ready. And if you're never ready, that's okay too. But we hope you know that you've already made our lives better just by letting us get to know you, your friends. Penn and Sophie *. He folded the paper and handed it to Mrs. Patterson, who tucked it into her apron pocket without reading it. I'll make sure she gets this, she said simply. As they prepared to leave, Penn hesitated at the door. Mrs. Patterson? When Bronte asked for time off, did she give you any indication of when she might be back? The older woman shook her head. She said she'd know when she knew. But Penn, I've been watching people work through hard times for more years than I care to count. And in my experience, the ones who ask for space because they're trying to figure things out are different from the ones who disappear because they've given up. Bronte struck me as the first kind. Outside in the truck, Sophie was unusually quiet. As they drove away from the diner, finally she spoke up. Daddy, what if Miss Bronte doesn't want to be found? What if she's happy being sad? Penn considered the question seriously. It was possible. Some people did find a kind of comfort in grief, a familiar identity that felt safer than the unknown territory of healing. But he thought about the way Bronte had smiled at the park, small and tentative but real. He thought about the hope he'd seen flickering in her eyes when they'd talked about honoring David's memory by living fully rather than simply surviving. I don't think she's happy being sad, he said finally. I think she's scared. And when people are scared, Sometimes they hide until they can figure out how to be brave. Like when I hid in my closet after Mommy moved away? Sophie asked, and Penn felt his heart clench at the memory of finding her there, surrounded by stuffed animals and old family photos. Exactly like that, he said gently. And remember what happened when I found you there. I didn't make you come out right away. I just sat with you until you felt ready. Sophie nodded thoughtfully. Maybe Miss Bronte needs someone to sit with her too. Even if it's not really sitting, but just ... knowing that someone would sit with her if she wanted them to. Penn stared at his daughter, amazed once again by her ability to distill complex, emotional truths into simple, clear understanding. That's exactly right, sweetheart. Sometimes the most important thing we can do for someone is just make sure they know they're not alone. Over the next few days, Penn found himself thinking about Bronte constantly. Not in a obsessive way, but with the kind of persistent concern that comes from caring about someone's well-being. He wondered if she'd received their message, if it had helped or hurt, if she was taking care of herself during whatever internal work she was doing. He also found himself paying attention to his own emotions in a way he hadn't since those difficult early months of single parenthood. The uncertainty about Bronte's well-being forced him to acknowledge how much their friendship had come to mean to him, how much hope he'd invested in the possibility of continuing to support each other through their respective healing journeys. Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after their conversation in the park, Penn and Sophie arrived at Morning Glory Diner with a mixture of hope and trepidation. They'd maintained their routine all week, partly out of habit and partly out of hope that Bronte might return to work and find them waiting in their usual booth. But as they settled into their seats, and Diane approached with her cheerful smile and order pad, Penn felt the familiar weight of disappointment settling over him. Another morning without Bronte. Another day of not knowing if their attempt to help had made things better or worse. Same as usual? Diane asked, but there was something different in her expression today, a kind of knowing look that made Penn's pulse quicken. Actually, Diane continued, glancing toward the kitchen, I think someone might want to take your order personally today. Penn felt his heart stop as Bronte emerged from the kitchen, moving slowly but purposefully toward their table. She looked different, thinner, maybe, with shadows under her eyes that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. But there was something else too, something in the way she carried herself that seemed less burdened than before. And when she reached their table and looked down at them, she was smiling, not the careful, professional smile she'd worn for months. Not even the tentative smile from their afternoon in the park. This was a real smile, warm and genuine and slightly nervous. The smile of someone who had made a difficult decision and was ready to see where it led. Hi, she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that Penn hadn't heard before. I was wondering if you two might be interested in having breakfast with a friend. Penn felt his breath catch in his throat as Bronte approached their table. Sophie nearly knocked over her orange juice in her excitement, her small hands clapping together as she bounced in her seat. Miss Bronte, you came back. We missed you so much, Sophie exclaimed, her voice carrying across the diner and drawing warm smiles from nearby customers who had witnessed this small family drama unfold over the past week. Bronte's smile widened, and Penn could see tears gathering in the corners of her eyes, but these were different tears, bright and clean. Nothing like the grief-stricken sobs he'd witnessed just over a week ago. I missed you too, Bronte said simply, sliding into the booth across from them. For the first time since Penn had known her, she wasn't holding a serving tray or order pad. She wasn't working. She was just here, present with them as a friend. Penn studied her face, searching for clues about what had happened during her week away. She did look tired, but there was something fundamentally different about her energy. The careful walls she'd maintained for months had come down, replaced by something softer but somehow stronger. How are you feeling? Penn asked gently, remembering his daughter's astute observation about being sad sick. Bronte took a deep breath, her hands clasped on the table in front of her. "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about," she said, "both of you, because what happened this week. I need you to understand something important." Sophie scooted closer to the window, making more room in the booth. "Are you going to tell us a story?" "In a way, yes," Bronte said, her voice steady but emotional. "A story about what happens when someone gives you permission to stop punishing yourself." Penn felt his heart skip, remembering their conversation in the park, the way they'd talked. About forgiveness and healing, and living fully enough for those who couldn't. "After our talk on Tuesday," Bronte continued, "I went home and I couldn't stop thinking about what you said. About David wanting me to be happy. About honoring his memory by living instead of just surviving. But the more I thought about it, the more scared I became." She paused, looking out the window toward the park where they'd had their breakthrough conversation. "For 2 years, grief has been my identity. Sadness has been my companion. Guilt has been my security blanket. As horrible as those feelings were, they were familiar. They were mine. And they connected me to David in a way that felt sacred." Penn nodded, understanding completely. He'd experienced something similar after his divorce, the way pain could become comfortable, the fear that letting go of hurt might mean letting go of love. "So Tuesday night, I panicked," Bronte admitted. "I called Mrs. Patterson and asked for time off because I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, and I wasn't sure if stepping forward meant flying or falling." "What did you do?" Sophie asked with the earnest curiosity of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. Bronte smiled at her. "I went to a place I hadn't been in 2 years, David's grave." Penn felt his throat tighten, but he remained quiet, sensing that this story needed to be told without interruption. "I brought a blanket and I sat there for hours," Bronte continued. "And I told him everything. About you two, about how you'd made me feel less alone. About how Penn had shown me that guilt wasn't love, and that surviving wasn't betrayal. About how Sophie had reminded me that families aren't just blood relations, but people who take care of each other." Sophie beamed at being mentioned, but stayed quiet, understanding the gravity of the moment. "And then," Bronte said, her voice catching slightly, "I told him how scared I was to be happy again. How guilty I felt about laughing, about looking forward to things, about wanting to have a future that didn't include him." She stopped, taking another deep breath, and Penn could see her gathering courage for whatever came next. "That's when I remembered something I'd forgotten," she said softly. "The last conversation David and I had before he left for work that day. We were lying in bed that morning, and he was telling me about this patient he'd helped the week before, an elderly woman who'd lost her husband of 50 years. She told David that her biggest regret wasn't that her husband had died, but that she'd spent the 5 years before his death so worried about losing him that she'd forgotten to enjoy having him." Penn felt goosebumps rise on his arms as he sensed the significance of this memory. "David looked at me that morning and said, 'Promise me something, Bronte. If anything ever happens to me, don't spend your life mourning what we lost. Celebrate what we had. Live enough for both of us.'" Bronte's voice broke slightly. "I'd completely blocked out that conversation. For 2 years, I couldn't remember his last words to me. But sitting there at his grave, it all came flooding back." Sophie reached across the table and took Bronte's hand, a gesture so natural and compassionate that it made Penn's chest ache with pride. "He asked you to be happy," Sophie said simply. "Just like when Daddy asks me to be brave when I'm scared." Bronte squeezed Sophie's hand. "Exactly like that," she said. "And that's when I realized that my grief hadn't been honoring David's memory, it had been dishonoring his last request." The revelation hung in the air between them, powerful and transformative. Penn could see the weight that had lifted from Bronte's shoulders, but also the courage it had taken to let it go. "But that's not even the most shocking part," Bronte continued. And Penn raised his eyebrows in surprise. How could there be more? "Wednesday morning, I drove to the cemetery office to ask about getting David's headstone engraved with that quote about living enough for both of us, she said. And that's when the groundskeeper told me something I never knew. Penn found himself leaning forward, completely absorbed in her story. Apparently, David had come to the cemetery about a month before he died, Bronte said, her voice filled with wonder. He'd arranged for a bench to be installed near the spot where he wanted to be buried someday. The groundskeeper said he'd specifically requested that it face east, toward the sunrise, and that he'd left instructions for an inscription. What did it say? Sophie asked breathlessly. Bronte's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling through them. It says, for Bronte, every sunrise is a gift. Don't waste them waiting for me. Love, David. Penn felt his own eyes welling up. The thoughtfulness, the foresight, the incredible. Love it must have taken for David to plan for Bronte's healing, even while he was still alive. It was almost overwhelming. He knew, Bronte whispered. Somehow he knew that I would struggle with guilt and grief, and he tried to give me permission to move forward even before he was gone. For 2 years, I've been visiting his grave and completely missing the message he left for me right there on a bench 10 feet away. Sophie was crying now too, though Penn wasn't sure she completely understood the magnitude of what Bronte was sharing. She just knew it was important and beautiful and sad and hopeful all at once. So what happens now? Penn asked gently. Bronte wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. Now I learn how to live, she said with quiet determination. Not just survive, but actually live the way David wanted me to. The way you and Sophie have been teaching me to. She paused, looking directly at Penn. And I was hoping you might still be interested in figuring it out together, because I realized something else this week. You and Sophie aren't just friends who helped me heal. You're the first glimpse I've had of what my new life might look like. And I want that life. I want to be the kind of person who makes other people feel less alone, the way you've made me feel. Penn felt something shift in his chest, a sense of possibility opening up that he'd been afraid to hope for. Are you saying what I think you're saying? Bronte smiled, and this time it reached her eyes completely. I'm saying that David's last gift to me wasn't just permission to move forward. It was showing me that love doesn't end when life does. It transforms. And I think maybe the best way to honor what I had with him is to be open to what I might have with someone else. She looked at both of them, her expression vulnerable but hopeful. If you'll have me, not as your sad waitress or your project to fix, but as your friend, your family, however you'll take me. Sophie launched herself across the table into Bronte's arms, nearly knocking over the entire place setting. We'll take you every way, she declared with 7-year-old certainty. Won't we, Daddy? Penn looked at Bronte, holding his daughter, in arms that no longer seemed burdened by invisible weight, smiling with joy that no longer carried guilt. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't just about surviving loss, but about building something new and beautiful from the pieces that remained. Every way, he confirmed softly. Every single way. And for the first time since David's death, Bronte Croft began to laugh. Not the careful, professional pleasantness she'd maintained at work, but real, genuine, life-affirming laughter that filled Morning Glory Diner with the sound of healing. Outside, the November sun climbed higher in the sky, casting golden light through the windows and illuminating 3 people who had found their way back to hope through this simple, powerful act of choosing to care for each other. What happened next in Morning Glory Diner was something that Mrs. Patterson would later describe as the most beautiful breakfast service she'd witnessed in 23 years of running the establishment. It wasn't just that 3 people who had found each other were finally sitting together as the family they'd unknowingly been building for months. It was the way healing looked when it finally took root, messy and tearful, and absolutely radiant. For the next hour, they didn't just eat breakfast. They rebuilt their story from the beginning, with all the context and understanding that had been missing before. Penn told Bronte about the very first morning he'd noticed her sadness, how Sophie's innocent question about the nice lady who always looked sad had planted a seed of concern that grew until he couldn't ignore it. Sophie, with the uninhibited honesty that 7-year-olds possess, recounted how she'd wanted to be friends with Miss Bronte from the very beginning because she seemed like she needed someone to share her cookies with. Bronte, in turn, shared things she'd never spoken aloud. How Penn and Sophie's presence had become the only bright spot in her carefully controlled days. How she'd started arriving at work early just to make sure their table was perfectly prepared. How Sophie's innocent wisdom about feelings being like weather had been the first thing to crack through her emotional armor in 2 years. "You want to know something?" Bronte said, her voice still slightly hoarse from crying but stronger than Penn had ever heard it. "Those napkins Sophie always drew on, I kept every single one. I have a shoebox at home with 43 of Sophie's drawings, every flower, every heart, every rainbow. They were like little messages that life could still be beautiful, even when I couldn't see it myself." Sophie's eyes went wide. "You kept them all? Even the messy ones?" "Especially the messy ones," Bronte said with a smile that transformed her entire face. "Because the messy ones were the most honest." Penn watched this exchange with something approaching awe. For months, he'd been witnessing 2 separate acts of love, his daughter's unconscious generosity and Bronte's quiet treasuring of those gifts, without realizing they were part of the same story. Now, seeing the complete picture, he understood that healing had been happening all along, in ways too subtle to notice, but too persistent to ignore. "Can I ask you something?" Penn said gently. "That morning when we first heard you crying in the kitchen, what happened? What finally broke through?" Bronte was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the table. "It was the anniversary," she said finally. 2 years to the day since David died. I'd been dreading it for weeks, but when it actually came, it felt different, less overwhelming than I expected. And that scared me more than the grief ever had. Penn felt his chest tighten with understanding. "You were afraid that feeling better meant forgetting him." "Exactly," Bronte whispered. "I'd built my entire identity around missing him. If I wasn't drowning in grief, who was I? What was left of what we had together?" She looked at Sophie, who was listening with the serious attention she usually reserved for bedtime stories. "And then this little one asked me if I was okay, and I realized that someone was actually seeing me. Not just taking my order or accepting my service, but really seeing me. And I couldn't remember the last time that had happened." Sophie reached across the table and patted Bronte's hand with the gentle confidence of someone who'd been comforting people her whole life. "Daddy says that when people go away, they don't really leave if you keep the good parts in your heart. The sad parts can go away, but the good parts get to stay forever." Penn felt tears prick his eyes. He'd said those words to Sophie during one of her difficult nights after Jennifer moved away, trying to help her understand that loving her mother didn't require holding onto the pain of missing her. Now, hearing his own parenting wisdom reflected back as comfort for Bronte, he realized how much his daughter had internalized the hard-won lessons of their shared healing. "That's exactly right," Bronte said, her voice thick with emotion. "And do you know what the best part is? David would have loved you. Both of you. He always said that the mark of a good person was whether they noticed when other people were hurting and whether they did something about it. You two did something about it." The conversation flowed naturally from there, filling in gaps and connecting dots that had been scattered across months of careful interaction. Bronte told them about the sleepless nights when she'd replayed their conversations, wondering if she was being unfair by letting them care about her when she felt so broken. Penn admitted that he'd often used Sophie's bedtime stories as an excuse to process his own complicated feelings about divorce and single parenthood. And that watching Bronte's quiet strength had taught him that resilience could look like showing up despite everything. "I need to tell you both something important," Bronte said as their plates were finally cleared away by Diane, who'd been giving them space with the practiced intuition of someone who understood when customers needed time. "When I disappeared last week, it wasn't because I was running away from you. It was because I was running toward something, and I needed to do it alone first." "What do you mean?" Penn asked. "I mean that for the first time in 2 years, I let myself imagine a future. A real future, not just survival. And that future had you in it. Both of you." Bronte's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if saying the words aloud was giving them substance. "But I needed to make sure I was choosing that future because I wanted it, not because I was afraid of being alone." Penn felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of fear he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "And what did you decide?" Bronte's smile was answer enough, but she gave him words. "Anyway, I decided that David gave me 2 gifts before he died. The first was showing me what it felt like to be loved completely. The second was asking me to carry that love forward, to use it to build something new rather than just protecting what was gone." She looked at Sophie, then at Penn, her eyes bright with tears that somehow looked like joy. "I want to build something new, with you, if you want that too." "That too." Sophie, who had been remarkably patient during this adult conversation, could contain herself no longer. "Does this mean you're going to be part of our family? Like for real?" The question hung in the air for a moment, stunning in its simplicity and directness. Penn found himself holding his breath, realizing that this 7-year-old had just asked the question he'd been afraid to voice himself. Bronte reached for both their hands, threading their fingers together in a gesture that felt both sacred and entirely natural. "If that's what you both want," she said softly, "then yes, I would love to be part of your family. However that looks, whatever that means, for as long as you'll have me." Penn felt tears streaming down his face, not tears of sadness or loss, but tears of recognition, of gratitude, of a kind of hope he'd forgotten was possible. "We want that," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We've wanted that since the first morning you smiled at Sophie's drawing and kept her napkin." "Really?" Sophie asked, bouncing slightly in her seat. "We're going to be a real family?" "The 3 of us." "The 3 of us," Bronte confirmed, and for the first time since Penn had known her, when she smiled, it reached every part of her face. Outside Morning Glory Diner, the November morning was growing warmer, the kind of unexpected gift that autumn sometimes offers. But inside Booth 6, 3 people who had found each other through loss and loneliness, and the simple courage to care were discovering that sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones you choose, the ones you build from kindness and shared healing and the decision to transform grief into love. They had no idea that their story was just beginning. 6 months later, on a warm May morning that smelled of fresh coffee and possibility, Penn Thorne stood in the kitchen of the small house he now shared with Bronte and Sophie, watching his daughter teach her new stepmother how to make what she called Daddy's almost perfect scrambled eggs. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had once burned breakfast daily was now considered the family's resident expert on egg preparation. The secret, Sophie was explaining with the serious authority of an 8-year-old, is to add just a tiny bit of milk and keep stirring them even when you think they're done. Daddy learned that from watching YouTube videos after Mommy moved away. Bronte laughed, the sound as natural and frequent now as it had once been rare. "YouTube University," she said, gently guiding Sophie's hand as they worked together at the stove. "Your father has quite an impressive degree from there." Penn smiled as he packed Sophie's lunch, marveling at how different their mornings looked now. Gone were the frantic searches for lost homework and the battles over what constituted an acceptable breakfast. In their place was this easy rhythm, this sense of shared purpose and joy that made even the most mundane tasks feel like small celebrations. They still went to morning, Glory Diner every Tuesday, it had become a family tradition, a way of honoring where their story began. But now Bronte sat across from them as family rather than serving them as customers, and Mrs. Patterson always made sure their regular booth was reserved with a small handwritten sign that read the Thorne Family Table. Changes in their lives had been both dramatic and subtle. Bronte had kept her job at the diner, but only part-time now, spending her mornings there and her afternoons pursuing the degree in counseling she'd abandoned after David's death. Penn had taken on more local construction projects, turning down the out-of-town work that would have meant time away from his new family. Sophie had blossomed in ways that amazed Penn daily. Her natural empathy and wisdom now had two adults to nurture and celebrate it, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew she was deeply loved. But perhaps the most remarkable change was what had happened to Morning Glory Diner itself. Word had somehow spread about the unlikely family that had formed over shared breakfasts and mutual healing, and the diner had become a gathering place for people who were struggling with loss, loneliness, or life transitions. Mrs. Patterson had started what she called Kindness Mornings every Wednesday, where people could come for coffee and conversation if they needed someone to listen. Bronte had volunteered to facilitate these sessions, drawing on her own experience with grief and her growing knowledge of counseling techniques. Penn watched from the kitchen doorway as customers who had once eaten in solitary silence now shared stories and offered each other comfort. There was Margaret, the widow who had rediscovered her love of painting after Sophie had admired her earrings and struck up a conversation. There was James, the veteran who had been struggling with depression, until Penn had invited him to help with a small construction project and discover he had a gift for woodworking. There was Sarah, the teenage mother who had found not just babysitting help from the diner community, but a network of support that had allowed her to finish high school. "We've accidentally created something beautiful here," Bronte had said one evening as they cleaned up after a particularly moving kindness morning. "People are finding each other, finding hope. Just like we did." The ripple effects extended far beyond the diner walls. Sophie's school had started a peer support program based on her suggestion that lonely kids just need someone to sit with them at lunch. Penn's construction company had begun partnering with local nonprofits to provide free home repairs for families in need, a project that Bronte had inspired and Sophie enthusiastically supported by organizing fundraising bake sales. But the most profound impact was perhaps the least visible, the way their story had shown three people that healing was possible, that love could grow from loss, that family could be chosen and built and treasured. Penn no longer felt like he was performing the role of father. He was living it fully, supported by a partner who understood both his struggles and his joys. Bronte had transformed from someone who survived each day to someone who embraced each morning, as David's inscription had requested, as a gift to be treasured rather than endured. Sophie had learned that families could grow and change and still be whole, that love didn't diminish when shared, but multiplied. On this particular May morning, as they prepared for their day like thousands of families across the country, Penn felt a familiar sense of gratitude wash over him. Not gratitude for having escaped pain. They all still carried their losses and had learned that grief never completely disappears, but gratitude for having discovered that pain shared is pain diminished, that joy shared is joy multiplied. "Daddy," Sophie said as they gathered their things for the day, "Mrs. Henderson at school asked me yesterday why our family is so happy. And I told her it's because we chose each other on purpose, not just because we had to be together." Penn felt his throat tighten with emotion. What did she say to that? "She said that sounded like the best kind of family," Sophie replied matter-of-factly. "And I told her that's what I thought too." As they walked to the car together, Bronte to the diner for her morning shift, Penn to his current job site, Sophie to school, Penn realized that their story had become something larger than any of them had anticipated. They weren't just a family who had found each other. They had become living proof that healing was possible, that connection could triumph over isolation, that kindness really could change everything. Later that day, as Penn picked Sophie up from school and they drove to the diner to meet Bronte for their Tuesday tradition, Sophie asked the question she posed every week. "Daddy, do you think there are other people like Miss Bronte was? People who are sad and don't smile but would be happy if someone just noticed them?" "I'm sure there are, sweetheart," Penn replied, as he always did. "Then we should keep looking for them," Sophie said with the casual certainty of someone who had learned that love was meant to be shared. Because everybody deserves someone to sit with them when they're scared. Penn smiled, thinking about the bench in the cemetery with David's inscription about not wasting sunrises, about the shoebox of napkin drawings that Bronte still kept, about the magical alchemy that had transformed 3 isolated people into a family. "You're absolutely right," he said. "We should keep looking." And as they pulled into the parking lot of Morning Glory Diner, where other customers were already gathering for their Tuesday evening community dinner, Penn realized that they already were. Every day, in small ways and large ones, they continued to look for people who needed someone to notice them, to care about them, to remind them that they weren't alone. Because that's what love does when it's allowed to grow freely. It spreads, it reaches. It transforms not just the people who experience it directly, but everyone whose life they touch. Penn Thorne had asked a simple question about why someone never smiled, and in doing so, had unleashed a chain reaction of healing that continued to ripple outward, one breakfast conversation at a time, inside the diner as they settled into their family booth and Bronte joined them after finishing her shift. Penn looked around at the warm, bustling community that had grown from their simple act of caring. Families were sharing meals, strangers were becoming friends, and in the corner booth, a new server was patiently listening to an elderly customer who clearly needed someone to hear his story. The cycle continued, the healing spread. And somewhere in the universe, Penn liked to think that David was smiling, knowing that his final gift to Bronte, permission to live fully, had blossomed into something even more beautiful than either of them could have imagined. "So," Bronte said, settling into the booth with the easy grace of someone who belonged exactly where she was, "tell me about your day." And as their voices joined the warm hum of conversation that filled Morning Glory Diner, Penn realized that this was what happiness looked like. Not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of love strong enough to hold both joy and grief, hope and fear, yesterday's losses and tomorrow's possibilities. Sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin with the simplest questions. Sometimes healing starts with nothing more than one person choosing to notice another person's pain. Sometimes families are built not from blood or legal documents, but from the decision to show up for each other, day after day, with kindness and patience and the radical belief that everyone deserves to be seen. Penn Thorne had learned all of this by asking a waitress why she never smiled. What he discovered in her answer changed not just his life, but the lives of everyone whose path they crossed. And in a world that often feels divided and disconnected, their story serves as a reminder that healing is possible, that love multiplies when shared, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply ask someone if they're okay, and then really listen to the answer. If this story has touched your heart, if it's reminded you of the power of kindness and the possibility of second chances, we'd love to hear from you. Share your own story of unexpected connection in the comments below. Tell us about a time when someone's kindness changed your life, or when you were able to make a difference in someone else's day just by paying attention. And if you believe, like we do, that there are more people in the world who need someone to notice them, someone to care about their story, someone to remind them they're not alone, then please subscribe and join our community of believers in everyday miracles. Because every time you choose kindness over indifference, every time you ask someone if they're okay and really mean it, every time you look beyond the surface to see the person underneath, You're continuing the story that Penn, Bronte, and Sophie started. The world needs more morning glory diners. It needs more people willing to ask the hard questions and sit with the complicated answers. It needs more families built on choice and love rather than obligation. And it needs more believers in the radical idea that healing is possible, that second chances are real, and that sometimes the most broken people can create the most beautiful families. Thank you for being part of this story. Thank you for believing in the power of connection. And thank you for choosing to see the people around you, really see them, because you never know when your simple act of noticing might be exactly what someone needs to remember that they're not alone. Until next time, keep asking the questions that matter. Keep choosing kindness. Keep believing in the possibility of healing. And keep your heart open to the extraordinary love that can grow from the most ordinary moments, because every sunrise is a gift. Don't waste them waiting for permission to live. 2 years after that first Tuesday morning when Penn Thorne asked a simple question about why someone never smiled, Morning Glory Diner received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a renowned grief counselor from the University of Chicago, had heard whispers about a small-town diner that had somehow become an informal healing center. She'd driven down to Oakwood Creek on a Saturday morning, curious about what she'd been told sounded too good to be true. What she found was a breakfast crowd unlike any she'd seen before. In one booth, a retired teacher was helping a young father practice reading aloud to his daughter, both of them laughing over mispronounced words. At another table, an elderly man was showing a teenage girl photos from his military service, while she shared stories about her college applications. Near the window, a woman with paint-stained fingers was sketching portraits of other customers, and those same customers were gathering around her table to watch, offering encouragement and sharing memories of their own creative dreams. At the center of it all, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for, was a family of 3 sitting in a corner booth marked with a small sign reading, "The Thorne Family Table." The father was helping his young daughter with homework, while a woman with kind eyes and auburn hair moved gracefully between tables, sometimes in uniform as she worked her shift, sometimes out of uniform as she sat with customers who needed someone to listen. Dr. Rodriguez ordered coffee and observed for over an hour. She watched as the auburn-haired woman, Bronte, she learned from overhearing conversations, knelt beside an elderly customer who was crying softly into his eggs. She saw the father, Penn, offer to help a struggling single mother load her groceries into her car. She noticed how the little girl, Sophie, naturally gravitated toward anyone who looked lonely, offering them drawings she'd made on napkins or simply sitting with them while they ate. "Excuse me," Dr. Rodriguez finally approached the family's table during a quiet moment. "I'm a researcher studying community healing. Would you mind if I asked you a question?" Penn looked up from Sophie's math homework, immediately protective but polite. "What kind of question?" "People keep telling me this diner has changed their lives, that it's become more than just a place to eat. I'm curious how that happened." Bronte set down her coffee cup, exchanging a look with Penn that spoke of shared understanding and the kind of shorthand that develops between people who've weathered storms together. "I think," Sophie said before either adult could respond, "it's because someone asked why somebody was sad, and then they decided to help. And then more people started asking and helping, and now everybody knows it's okay to be sad here, but it's also okay to get better." Dr. Rodriguez blinked, surprised by the profound simplicity of the answer. "And who was the someone who first asked?" Sophie pointed at her father with obvious pride. "Daddy asked Miss Bronte why she never smiled. And when she told him why, it made him cry. But then they figured out how to help each other, and now we're a family, and we help other people too." Penn reached over to smooth down Sophie's hair, a gesture Dr. Rodriguez could see was as automatic as breathing. "It wasn't anything dramatic," he said quietly. "I just noticed that someone was hurting and asked if she was okay. Everything else grew from there. But that's just it. Dr. Rodriguez said, leaning forward with growing excitement. What you've created here, this community of care, this space where people feel safe to be vulnerable, this is exactly what we try to accomplish in formal therapy settings. How did you know to do it? Bronte and Penn looked at each other again, and Bronte spoke for the first time. We didn't know, she said simply. We just knew what it felt like to hurt alone, and we didn't want anyone else to have to do that. Dr. Rodriguez spent the rest of the day at Morning Glory Diner, interviewing customers and observing interactions. She met Margaret, whose art was now being displayed in local galleries after the community had encouraged her to pursue her passion. She spoke with James, whose handmade furniture had become so popular that he'd been able to start his own business. She listened to Sarah, now a sophomore in college thanks to the academic support and childcare help she'd received from the diner community. But most remarkable of all were the stories of people who had simply learned to smile again, to trust again, to hope again, because strangers had chosen to see them and care about their well-being. Would you mind if I wrote about this? Dr. Rodriguez asked as she prepared to leave. Not using names, of course, but the model you've created it could help other communities. Penn shrugged with characteristic modesty. Write whatever you think might help. But I hope you'll make it clear that we didn't set out to create a model or a program. We just decided to notice each other. And, Sophie added seriously, we learned that families don't have to look the same as other families. Sometimes the best families are the ones you choose because you love each other on purpose. 6 months later, Dr. Rodriguez's paper was published in the Journal of Community Psychology. Titled The Morning Glory Model, How Informal Networks of Care Emerge from Simple Acts of Noticing. It detailed how a single question asked by a concerned stranger had catalyzed the creation of an organic healing community. The paper sparked interest from social workers, community organizers, and mental health professionals across the country. Delegations began visiting Oakwood Creek to observe the Morning Glory Diner phenomenon firsthand. Documentary filmmakers arrived to capture the story. Magazine writers came to interview the family at the center of it all. But Penn, Bronte, and Sophie continued to live their lives much as they always had. They still had their Tuesday family breakfasts. Bronte still worked her shifts at the diner while pursuing her counseling degree. Penn still ran his construction company, though now he often employed people the diner community had connected him with. Sophie still drew pictures on napkins for anyone who looked like they might need a reminder that someone cared. And people still arrived at Morning Glory Diner carrying invisible burdens: grief, loneliness, anxiety, despair, and somehow found themselves part of a community that had learned the radical art of showing up for each other. One Tuesday morning, as the Thorne family finished their breakfast, a young woman approached their table hesitantly. She was thin, exhausted-looking, with the kind of careful composure that Penn immediately recognized. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I heard about this place online, about how people here help each other. I'm going through a really difficult divorce, and I have 2 young kids, and I don't really know anyone in town. I was wondering." She trailed off, unsure how to ask for what she needed. Sophie immediately scooted over in the booth. "You can sit with us," she said matter-of-factly. "That's what we do here. We sit with people who need sitting with." As the woman gratefully took the offered seat, Penn caught Bronte's eye across the table. In her smile, he saw the same recognition. He felt in his own chest. Here was someone else whose life was about to change. Someone else who would discover that healing was possible, that families could be chosen, that love really did multiply when shared. The cycle continued. The ripples spread. And in a small diner in Oakwood Creek, the revolution of kindness that had begun with a simple question about why someone never smiled continued to transform lives, one breakfast conversation at a time. Some stories end when the protagonist finds happiness. But the best stories, the ones that change the world, are the ones that never really end at all. They just keep spreading, one person at a time, one act of noticing at a time, one chosen family at a time, because the most powerful gift you can give someone isn't money or advice or solutions to their problems. Sometimes the most powerful gift is simply asking, "Are you okay?" And then caring enough to listen to the answer. That's how a single dad's question about a waitress's smile became a movement. That's how 3 broken people became a healing family. That's how a small-town diner became proof that the world can be changed by anyone willing to see the person standing right in front of them. The revolution of kindness continues. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.